Well, I'm really excited about the message tonight because it's going to speak into some personal things, even from my own life. So if you have a Bible, you can turn to the book of Exodus, chapter 3. And we're actually going to be looking at a few different passages out of Exodus. Some of them will be familiar, but we're going to see a theme here tonight. And the theme has to do with mountains. Ooh, that's right. In fact, mountains are a big deal to God. Can you believe it? As you read through the Bible, many key events take place on mountains. I mean, think about it. Noah's Ark, right, goes through the whole flood, everything, but then he ends up that the ark settles down on the mountains of Ararat. Okay, we know the famous story of Abraham offering up Isaac. It happened on a mountain, Mount Moriah in that case. We know that when God gives a covenant for the Israelites to come into the promised land, there's the mountain of blessing and there's the mountain of cursing, where they read out what's going to happen to the Israelites if they don't follow the law. We know that perhaps the most famous prophet of the Old Testament, or certainly one of the most famous, Elijah, has his key moment on Mount Carmel, when fire comes down from God, and it comes down on a mountain. And those are just a few examples. There are many more, but we know that even in Jesus' life and ministry, a lot of key events take place on mountains. Jesus is tempted on a mountain, right? We know that Satan takes him up onto a mountain to tempt him there. We know that Jesus preaches from mountains. That's why we get the Sermon on the Mount, among others. And we know that one of the most amazing events of Jesus' earthly ministry was the transfiguration that happened, and that also took place on a mountain. So you might be saying, okay, we're hearing a lot about mountains from the Bible, but what is God's purpose in using mountains as a picture? Well, we'll talk about that more tonight. Mountains, though, aren't just an abstract concept. They actually exist in the real world. And for me, mountains were a really big part of growing up. You see, many of you know I grew up in Germany, and specifically in southern Germany, where there are a lot of mountains. And so even from a young age, I was out in the mountains with my family, sometimes just with my dad alone, but we would spend many different days hiking in the mountains. In fact, it was more common on a typical weekend to go mountain climbing than not. And then later we moved to Seattle, and wouldn't you know it, there are mountains out in Washington, so many more years of mountain climbing in the Cascades. So mountains were a big part of my growing up. Now, mountains are interesting. Many of you have seen mountains, experienced mountains, but in Minnesota, we don't have the real deal. We don't have the real mountain experience. And I think usually when people think of mountains, they think of skiing or maybe even Buck Hill or something like that. But a real mountain changes the environment more than you would think. In fact, sometimes growing up, when we went into the mountains, it would be drizzling or maybe even raining at the bottom of the mountain. But as we started climbing up further and further, eventually you get up above the clouds and you can see the weather below you, but then up above, you have all kinds of sunshine and amazing weather. Mountains also have seasons of their own, meaning it might be spring or even fall down in the valley, but up in the mountains, it looks like it's deepest winter. Things can still be covered in snow. So mountains are an amazing place. And I'll be sharing a few different personal experiences about mountains in the message tonight, which is exciting. But how does a mountain picture our walk with God? Well, in the case of Moses and the Israelites, we find out that God brings people to different levels in their relationship with him, and it corresponds to different places on the mountain where they encounter him. So let's look at Exodus chapter 3. We'll start in verse 1. Now Moses was tending the flock of Jethro, his father-in-law, the priest of Midian, and he led the flock to the back of the desert and came to Horeb, the mountain of God. And the angel of the Lord appeared to him in a flame of fire from the midst of a bush. So he looked, and behold, the bush was burning with fire, but the bush was not consumed. Then Moses said, I will now turn aside and see this great sight, why the bush does not burn. Now, many of us know this passage, but it's such a turning point in the life of Moses, because he decides to go out of the way, out of the ordinary way, and he decides, I'm coming up to this mountain, the flock is here, I'm seeing something that's different. There's something unusual about this mountain. I'm going to turn aside to see what it is. And verse 4, so when the Lord saw that he turned aside to look, God called to him from the midst of the bush. And that's where, in some ways, the story really begins. This is a turning point in the life of Moses. He encounters God in a powerful way, but I want to suggest that when it comes to relationships with God, as pictured by mountains, the first step is a decision. You see, Moses had to decide, I'm going to turn aside. I'm going to turn aside to see this great sight. And then God speaks to him. Isn't that interesting? Because God could have been speaking to him the whole time. But once God saw that he made a decision, he's going to turn aside, see what is this thing that God's doing over here, what's going on. The decision opened the door for further encounter. Now, eventually, God explains who he is to Moses. He explains his plans to get the Israelites out of Egypt. But after he says these things, there's one promise that I want to highlight, and it's in verse 12. This is God speaking. So he said, I will certainly be with you, and this shall be a sign to you that I have sent you. When you have brought the people out of Egypt, you shall serve God on this mountain. Isn't that interesting? You will serve God on this mountain. Moses, this is the place where you made a decision for me, where you turned aside and I'm meeting with you. And in the very place where you made a decision for me, I'm going to bring others, and they are going to encounter me too. When we look at mountains, it's not just for one person. Often, especially if you're tackling a difficult mountain, you might have a whole expedition, a whole crew that goes up together to meet the challenge. So when we hear the word challenge, it might bring up a question. What does it actually take to climb a mountain? Now, of course, it depends a lot on the mountain. There are some mountains that are almost like foothills. They're pretty easy, not very steep. It's not that hard. You go for a little bit. You kind of notice the uphill a bit, but before long, you're overlooking the valleys and you're up top. Okay, that's an easier climb. You can almost call it mountain hiking rather than mountain climbing. Okay. But then there are mountains that take a little more technical skill. Now, do we have any rock climbers in here that are more technically advanced or enjoy rock climbing? Not? Okay, all right. The Minnesotans are all shaking their head. All right, maybe the folks online, the viewers from Colorado, are shouting and cheering right now, okay? But there are more technical mountains that take different kinds of skill sets. Now, because I was a kid in my mountain days, I never, had extremely, extremely hard climbs, but there were some times when I went with my dad, we would cross the border into Austria, and the mountains in Austria are bigger, they're higher up than the mountains in Germany. And there was a range of mountains called the Wild Caesar, and they're very pointy peaks, they're more difficult, and we went up together. I think my cousin was along for one of those hikes. He came to visit from America. Boy, he didn't know what he was getting. And we started climbing up this mountain. It got more and more difficult. You start off at the bottom, and it's usually trees. And that was the same in Washington, too. You kind of start in a forest. You can't see much, kind of obscure. But then as you go higher up, there are fewer and fewer trees, and you get past the tree line. And then you get cliffs and rock faces, and those tend to be a little more tricky when it comes to climbing up them. And on that particular climb, we went up this ledge, and all of a sudden, we were up high enough where there was a drop. And the path continued along the edge of the mountain, but it was only about a foot wide. And then the drop was maybe 2,000 feet. And so the good thing was we weren't the first people to ever climb that mountain. So the people that had come before us had put metal pegs into the side of the mountain and a metal rope, or cable, I guess, that went along the side. So you could hold on to the cable as you shimmied across that narrow spot. And I asked my dad, I said, "Dad, how do you walk across a place like this?" And he was kind of debating. He thought, should I take this 7-year-old across this spot or not? But he said, let's do it. He said, the key is don't look down, because when you're walking like this, it's kind of tempting to look behind you and see the 2,000-foot drop that's kind of at the edge of your heels. And there was a reality of, if you look down, you can kind of feel like you're going to lose your balance. So one of the rules is both hands on the cable, and don't look down. You just watch your footing, but don't look all the way down. And you shimmy until you get to the path. I didn't fall and die. Still here. But it was an interesting experience. So sometimes there's a little more technicality when it comes to climbing than others. And I know some people here have at least heard of, if you haven't done it yourself, of real belaying and equipment that's needed is at a different level. But what does it take to climb? Well, number one, it takes work. Because if you don't want to do anything, if you just want to sit back, you're never going to get to the top of the mountain. Unless there's a ski lift. That's cheating. Number two, it takes diligence, especially if you're on one of the longer hikes. Because you can be going for a while and think, okay, this isn't too bad, but some mountain climbs take several hours. And partway through, you might be thinking, I'm not so sure I want to go anymore. I want to take a break. This is tough, but when you're partway up the mountain, it isn't always easy to turn back. So it takes diligence. And number three, like I mentioned, it can sometimes take equipment. What do I mean by equipment? Well, the metal cable would be an example, but even if you're not doing anything that extreme, it's really good to have a walking stick with you if you're going on a mountain hike. Why? Even if you don't need it going uphill, when you're descending and go back downhill, and you're kind of coming down a steep area, it's really helpful to be able to not put all of your weight, especially if you have a backpack onto your knees. It's nice to distribute some of the weight on a walking stick, or ideally two. But there's something else. And this might sound obvious, but there's a little something called experience that plays such a key role when you're mountain climbing. You see, when you've done it enough times, all of a sudden you realize, this is how I place my feet. This is how I step without slipping. This is how I do these various tasks. And with experience, the climb gets easier. Doesn't that sound a lot like our walk with God? When you walk with God for a while, there might be someone who comes up to you and they're a totally new believer and they say, "How can you even do this? God is asking me to do this and this. How can I possibly do that?" Well, if you're an experienced Christian, you might be able to come alongside a new believer and give them some wisdom. God's given us some good equipment in the Word. He also supplies us with other believers to help. It takes diligence in our walk with God. We see that. And it takes work going up a mountain. Now, we know in our walk with God, we can't get to God through works. We're not saying that, okay? We know that salvation comes through grace. But even though God opens the door for us to be saved, and even though His grace is present in our lives and we need it, we can't do it without Him. There is that piece of diligence and continuing on that's so important. And just like with Moses, God often responds to us. And are we willing to turn aside and do things differently? Okay, so if number one, in terms of a level of encountering God on a mountain, is a decision, let's look at number two. Let's go to Exodus 19. So we're just going a few chapters further. This is after the Israelites come out of Egypt, and now that promise that God made earlier comes to pass. They meet God at the mountain. Exodus 19. And we'll start in verse 14. So Moses went down from the mountain to the people and sanctified the people, and they washed their clothes. Isn't that interesting? When the people want to meet with God, they prepare themselves. Do you prepare yourself when you're going to meet with God? Or is it just kind of a flippant thing where you think, "Oh, well, I guess I'm going to say my prayer"? Or do you say, "Wait a minute, I'm about to meet with the King of Kings, with the Lord of Lords. I need to prepare my heart to meet with this one"? They prepared themselves. Verse 15, He said to the people, "Be ready for the third day. Do not come near your wives." And then it came to pass on the third day in the morning that there were thunderings and lightnings and a thick cloud on the mountain, and the sound of the trumpet was very loud, so that all the people who were in the camp trembled. And Moses brought the people out of the camp to meet with God, and they stood at the foot of the mountain. Okay, so they're still at the bottom, they're at the foot of the mountain, but they're ready to meet with God. Verse 18, Now Mount Sinai was completely in smoke, because the Lord descended upon it in fire. Its smoke ascended like the smoke of a furnace, and the whole mountain quaked greatly. And when the blast of the trumpet sounded long and became louder and louder, Moses spoke, and God answered him by voice. Wow. Can you imagine being there? Can you imagine being one of the Israelites? You're in front of this huge mountain. God's coming down in fire. There's a trumpet sound coming from heaven, and there's an earthquake. If that doesn't shake you up, I don't know what would. I mean, talk about the fear of the Lord. Whew. The people have an interesting response, and this is in the next chapter, chapter 20. When they see all of this happening, God gives the 10 commandments, the people are shaking, and then in chapter 20, verse 18, this is the response of the people. Now all the people witnessed the thunderings, the lightning flashes, the sound of the trumpet, and the mountain smoking, and when the people saw it, they trembled and stood afar off. Then they said to Moses, You speak with us, and we will hear, but let not God speak with us, lest we die. That is important. So verse 18 says they were witnessing, and that's actually our second point. So number one for our journey up a mountain with God, number one is a decision. That's kind of like the base, the beginning. That's what Moses had at the very beginning when he encountered God at the burning bush. He made a decision for God. But number two is what the children of Israel experienced that day, and that is they were witnesses. They had encountered God in Egypt. He had brought them out of slavery, and they were at the point where they were seeing God move. They heard his voice from afar. They were witnesses. They said, "We see you're real, God. We acknowledge you. You're our God." But they weren't willing to go further than that. That's where they stopped. They stopped at the witness level. Some of us have witnessed God do amazing things in our lives, and praise God for that. We love to share the testimonies of what God has done. But as we're going to find out, there are higher levels of walking with God than just making a decision for him or just being a witness to what he does. Very important. And you can understand, in a way, why the children of Israel said, "We don't want to go any further up this mountain. Moses, you talk to God." But this is so much. They felt a real danger. Now, Moses had already encountered God before. Moses was more familiar with walking with God. And so even though things seemed crazy all around, because he knew God so well, he didn't have to tremble in the same way that the Israelites did. Just keep that in mind in your own walk with God, that some days, sometimes things seem like a storm, just like with the disciples when they were on the shipping or in the boat in the ship where the storm came and they were terrified, and Jesus says, "Why are you crying out? What is this unbelief?" And he rebukes the storm and it goes away. He had perfect peace. As we walk deeper with God, may we walk in that perfect peace of knowing him. But what are some of the dangers when it comes to mountains? This is some of the experience thing that we talked about earlier too, right? If you have experience, you know how to face mountain dangers. Now, I'll be honest, I've never been on a mountain where God came down and it started to smoke with fire and, there weren't any trumpets like that. So that's a whole different level. But just being out in the mountains, there were some dangers that we had to face at times. One we already mentioned, and that is storms. Storms can move quickly anywhere, but when you're in a mountain, storms can come very fast. The weather can change in 5 minutes. You can have sunshine, everything's great, and especially out in the Alps, all of a sudden, weather changes would happen, and we'd look up, and there was blue sky one moment, suddenly black clouds were coming in, and we go, uh-oh, we need to seek shelter. When a storm comes, here's a little trick. There's different kinds of trees in Germany, and my dad and I discovered when it really starts to pour, if you stand under a tree with leaves, it'll keep you dry for a few minutes, but if it's a long rain, eventually the water trickles down through the leaves and you get soaked. But if you stand under one of those big old pines, you will stay dry even if it pours for over an hour. And so my dad and I, when it would really start to pour and we had to seek shelter, we'd look for one of those big pine trees and just stand under it. And sometimes, even if we stood there for half an hour, we'd be completely dry. No water would get through those. So storms are a danger, okay? That can be a real issue, actually. There was one time when we were near the top of a mountain. I remember this. It's kind of coming to mind now. This was also in Austria. But there was a big mountain lake. There were no trees up top. So when you're at the top of a mountain that has a bit of a plateau, and there's a lake and there's no trees, guess who the highest point is? It's you. And we were at a moment in our little hike, and we were hiking around the lake, and suddenly storm clouds moved in. Things got really dark, and it started to thunder. And my dad and I looked at each other, and we looked at the thunder, and we were thinking, we are the highest point. If lightning strikes, it's going to strike us. Now, I've heard it said that if you're about to get struck by lightning, try to be on the heels of your feet. Supposedly that makes the impact more tolerable. I wasn't going to find out. We quickly went downhill as fast as we could. I mean, we were almost running to get away from that storm, and we did. And as we were going down the side of the mountain and looked up, we could see lightning striking that lake that we had been at a few moments before. So we were happy to not be the highest point anymore. But what else? There are other mountain dangers besides just storms. There's also rock slides. Now in German, an avalanche and a rock slide has the same name. It's just a snowy rock slide or just a rocky rock slide, okay? They're both called avalanches, but in English, avalanche only applies to snow. But basically, rock slides are nasty because you can have some rocks coming down a hill, and as they tumble, they shatter and break into lots of little rocks. It's almost like shrapnel. You don't want to be out in an open area when that happens. But sometimes as you're climbing up a mountain, you can kind of tell where some sliding rock has broken through trees and different things, and you have to cross it to get to the next part of the path. And my dad taught me when I was young, he said, Max, if there's a shaking that starts to happen when you're out in these open areas and rocks start coming down, he said, what do? I said, I don't know. He said, get behind the biggest boulder you can find. And I was thinking, but if there's an earthquake or something, couldn't the boulder fall on you? He said, it's true. If the boulder moves, you're dead. He said, but if you're anywhere out and about, you're definitely going to die. So you better be under the boulder, because then there's a chance the boulder will stay in place. You won't get hit by all the shrapnel. It won't be able to get past the boulder. It's interesting, in the Hebrew, that term for rock that you see throughout the Psalms, the Lord is my rock and my salvation, it's not just a little rock, a little stone that you hold in your hand. It's a huge boulder. It's almost like part of a mountainside, but the reason it's translated as rock is because there's no word in the English language that adequately describes such a huge, massive piece of rock. So it's just translated rock. In German, it's Felsen. It's a huge, massive rock. And so we learned even back then that if a rock slide happens, you get under a big rock. What a picture of Jesus. And the third danger in the mountains, I mean, technically, are there more dangers? Yes, there can be wild animals, there can be different things, but of all my times in the mountains, I very rarely encountered any dangerous animals. Sometimes, you see a bear far off or something, but nothing where you're going, uh-oh, I'm about to be attacked. But the third danger that you would see more commonly is people would get lost. You don't want to get lost in the mountains, especially if you're way out in the middle of nowhere. And so in Germany, there's a lot of people that live in a small amount of land area. So technically you could get lost in the mountains, but you're probably always within a few miles of the next person. But out in Washington State, that wasn't the case. You could be way out in the middle of the Cascades, and who knows if another person would come by that path for the next month or two. So if you got lost, it was a big deal. And there was a time, my dad and I, that day, we went over to the other side of Puget Sound. We went to the Olympics, which is another mountain range. And we didn't go to the Olympics often, so we didn't know our way as well. Now, beautiful scenery, beautiful meadows with flowers as we were hiking up this mountain path. And some of you maybe have heard the story before, but we got to kind of near the top of this mountain area, and there was an Asian gentleman, an older man, who was sitting there, and he said, "Oh, you came up this way?" We said, "Yes." He said, "Well, if you go back around this way, it's a beautiful scenic path, and it's a loop that'll take you back to where you started." We said, "Oh, well, thank you." We didn't know the gentleman. We never saw him again, but we thought, well, let's give it a try. We didn't check a map first. So we started on this path going down, and it was maybe noon at that point, and we were going down, and we thought, okay, maybe it took us about 5 hours to come here, so it'll take about 5 hours on this other path to get back to where we were parked. But 5 hours came and went, and we kept walking, and then it was 6 o'clock, and then it was 7 o'clock, and then it started to get darker, and when you're kind of in some of those forests and you're starting to hear different animals and different things, you're thinking, how close are we? And then it got later and later, and it was 8 o'clock, and eventually you're starting to see stars come out, and it was 9 o'clock, and we thought, we are in trouble. So we started walking really fast, and it was nighttime. And we still were walking, and we realized we have never hiked this path before. Are we lost? It was an interesting experience, but eventually we did get back to the vehicle. It was pitch black, and then we had to drive a long way around, around the peninsula, around Puget Sound to get back home. And it ended up being a very long expedition. Our feet were really hurting because we were not used to hiking for, I don't know if it ended up being a 14-hour hike, but it was a long hike. You can get lost on some mountains. So those are dangers that we can face. But the thing is, even if we're on a mountain with God, we might face things that we don't know how to deal with. We might encounter things that are unfamiliar to us. But as you walk with God, He can bring you not only to places you haven't been before, but He's willing to lead you by His Holy Spirit. So as you face some of the challenges of life, as you face some of those obstacles, you can know, okay, God, maybe I've never walked with you through this thing before, but you've given me a guide. And if I'm willing to listen to that guide, if I'm willing to listen to the voice of the Holy Spirit, if I'm willing to search out your word, if I'm willing to pursue you in it, you will help lead me the right way. It's a lot better to follow God than some random stranger on a mountain peak that you've never met before. All right, we've talked about making a decision. We've talked about being a witness, but there's a higher level up the mountain. And here we're just going to turn the page a little bit, or maybe a couple pages, to Exodus 24. This is the next level of relationship with God as we go up the mountain. This one's important. Exodus 24. And we'll start in verse 1. This is God speaking. Now he said to Moses, "Come up to the Lord, you and Aaron, Nadab and Abihu, and 70 of the elders of Israel, and worship from afar. And Moses alone shall come up near the Lord, but they shall not come near, nor shall the people go with them." So God's separating out a group now that he's bringing up with Moses to a higher place. So the Israelites, in general, are still kind of at the foot of the mountain. They're still at the witness level. But now these elders are being brought up to a higher place with God. And we're going to find out what God does there. Let's go to verse 9. Then Moses went up, also Aaron, Nadab, Abihu, and the 70 elders of Israel. And look what happens. They saw the God of Israel. And there was under his feet, as it were, paved work of sapphire stone, and it was like the very heavens in its clarity. But on the nobles of the children of Israel he did not lay his hand. Here's the key. So they saw God, and they ate and drank. Wow. Wouldn't that be something? They saw God, but isn't it interesting, of all the different things they could do, of all the things that God could use to represent another layer, another level of walking with him, he chose communion. Because that's really what's happening there, is the people are sitting down before the Lord. What a picture of the New Testament of the Lord's Supper. They're eating and they're drinking before God. They're encountering God. Now down below, at the beginning there was a decision. Then you come to the base of the mountain with the Israelites, and they're witnesses. Now we see the elders coming up to another level, and they're communing with God. They're seeing God in a different way. They're eating, they're fellowshipping together, and it's a higher place of interaction with God. There are benefits that come when we operate in a higher way with God. Let's talk about that for a moment. I mean, we've talked about some of the challenges when it comes to climbing up mountains. We've talked about some of the dangers involved. What are the benefits? Why do people even go into the mountains in the first place? Well, number one, when you're out in the mountains, things are clean and they're pure. I mean, if you think it's nice here, if you breathe in some mountain air, it's fresh. It's just such a fresh air out there where you just go, I'm out in the mountains. Nothing like it. It's clean. In fact, not only is the air clean, not only is the landscape clean, but even the water. If you want the best water you've ever had in your life, go up to a mountain brook and take a drink. Nothing like it. In fact, even I remember in Germany, there were spots where the water would come right out of the side of the mountain, just out of the rock, where the mountain itself was filtering the water. So you knew it wasn't like a river where, some animals might die in the river, and then you get the water out of the river and you drink that and you go, ooh, there's something in there. But when it comes right out of the side of the mountain, it's totally perfectly clean and pure. That's why some of the bottled water brands that people pay big money for, it's out of either natural aquifers or out of mountainsides or mountain springs that produce just fresh water, and people love that taste. And it usually has good minerals in it too. So there's a purity when you go up a mountain. And it's like that with God too. As we walk with God, as we come into higher places with God, He changes our hearts. We come into a place where we realize, wow, God isn't like my friends. God isn't like the people that I interact with. God is so pure. He's so holy. He's so clean. You just realize, my goodness, as I'm with God, I begin to change. And one of the benefits of being in a mountain is that purity. Another thing, and this is one we don't always think about, is as you go up a mountain, there's a fellowship that happens. You see, if you're in a group, you're all overcoming together. If you get to a mountain peak, there's a place where often other people, even if they started in different parts of the mountain base, you all come to the same peak, and often people rest near the summit because they can just enjoy, I made it. I got to the top. And others around you, even if they're from different walks of life you don't know, you can encounter that fellowship together. And now this isn't the case in the United States, but it is the case in Germany. When you get to a mountain peak, they usually have a big cross set up. Pretty much all the mountain peaks have a large wooden cross at the top. And what a picture as you come into a higher place that you can commune with God. It's such a picture of walking with Jesus. You come to higher places with him. You get to know him better. You get to experience him deeper, and you encounter him, and you see things differently, which really is a transition into the third benefit. It's the perspective, the view. There's nothing like it. You maybe can see for a few miles here and there when you're on a flat ground or maybe on a little hill, but when you're up on a mountain peak, you can see for miles and miles and miles all around you. Go, wow. You can see other summits many, many miles away. Oh, that's a peak, that's a peak, that's a peak. Sometimes you can even see other landscape features way off in the distance that you couldn't usually see. What's that a picture of? I mean, isn't that such a perfect image for walking with God? As we're with God, he takes us high, and all of a sudden, the things in life that felt so difficult, maybe the challenges that we're facing where we go, God, I don't even see what the key is. I can't get a way out of this situation. I feel stuck. But as we walk with God and he takes us to a higher vantage point, suddenly we go, oh, Lord, you're showing me my life in a way I've never seen it before. God, I didn't realize this was the issue. Now I know what to do. Or maybe it's, God, my problems seemed so huge, but from up here with you, they seem so small down there. When you're higher up on a mountain and you look down and you see people coming up the bottom, they just look like little ants. They're so tiny from that perspective, from that vantage point. And it's like that when we come to higher places with God, our perspective totally changes. I want to pause there, though, because we're talking about levels with God using this mountain picture. And it's one thing to talk about, here's what's available to you. But are you experiencing those things with God? Are you experiencing times away with him where he takes you to a higher place? Are you experiencing those times with God where he changes your perspective, where you experience his purity, where you have times of deep fellowship? I just want to challenge us today. Make time for God. Pursue him into places you've never gone to with him before. Because we can talk about all the potentials, all of what's available, but we do need to act on it. And he's inviting us into that relationship with him. Those are some of the benefits of going up a mountain. Okay. We've talked about making a decision. Okay, that was number one in terms of a place on the mountain. We've talked about being a witness. We talked about communion, but now we're going to look at a fourth level. And this one is also in the book of Exodus, and it kind of starts right where we left off, and it's about Moses. So Exodus 24, and now we're going to look at verse 12. Then the Lord said to Moses, "Come up to me on the mountain and be there." And then he's going to give him the tablets of stone, but he's saying, "Come up to me." Moses, the Israelites are down there. The elders have come up higher to a place of communion, but Moses, you come away with me. Verse 13, so Moses arose with his assistant Joshua, and Moses went up to the mountain of God. Wow. By the way, that's a little key in there that's easy to miss. Moses was called up by God, but Joshua tagged along. If you know people that have a walk with God that's very deep, try to tag along. Whenever they let you, go along with them, because as you hang out with those people, as you pray with those people, as you wait on God together, as you experience things with them, you'll find that you get to go to places with God that others have gone before you. And it almost makes a bridge for you to enter into new levels of relationship with God yourself. All right, let's keep going. Verse 14, he said to the elders, "Wait here for us until we come back to you. Indeed, Aaron and Hur are with you. If any man has a difficulty, let them go to them." What's Moses doing? Even though he knows he's being called to a higher place with God, he's still taking care of the practical needs, right? He's still been put in charge over all of Israel. So he's not letting his walk with God, this is important, he's not just saying, oh, because I walk with God, nothing else matters. No, he's still taking care of his godly responsibilities, but he's also saying, I'm going deeper with God, but I'm going to take care of some of these things. In this case, he's delegating leadership to take care of some of the needs. Okay, Moses goes up the mountain. God encounters him there. There's a lot of things that happen. Okay? For the sake of time, we're not going to go into the full story right now. In Exodus 32, we see that God speaks to Moses in an interesting way because God gives Moses lots and lots of commands at this point. Do this, do that. God's encountering Moses over the course of 40 days and 40 nights. It's just God and Moses together on this mountain, okay, for the next several chapters. But as soon as Israel sins in chapter 32, God immediately knows it. And isn't it interesting? Moses immediately knows it too because God tells him. You see, sometimes you get to a place of deeper walking with God where all of a sudden God reveals his secrets and his heart to you. But we will turn to chapter 34 because I want us to catch this. This is kind of the final passage that we're going to look at together. Exodus 34. This is when Moses has been meeting with God. He came down to deal with the Israelites. They sinned. Then he goes back up to God, waits on him another 40 days and 40 nights. God gives some further instructions. And look what happens when he comes down. Exodus 34, verse 29. And it was so when Moses came down from Mount Sinai, and the 2 tablets of the testimony were in Moses' hand when he came down from the mountain, that Moses did not know that the skin of his face shone while he talked with him. Wow. Moses came into such a place with God where God rubbed off on him. The glory of God could even be seen on Moses. I mean, we're not just talking about making a decision. We're not just talking about witnessing something afar off. We're not even saying just a place of communing or having communion with God. This was deeper. At the end of Moses' life, it says that Moses was someone who had an amazing friendship with God. God spoke to him face to face as a man would speak to his friend. So the 4th level of relationship on this mountain with God is friendship. And there aren't very many people in the Bible that God said, this is a friend of God. There are just a few. But Moses was one of them. Wow. It's so amazing. Once you know the God of the mountain itself doesn't seem so scary anymore. All of a sudden, the fears and the dangers and the other things, they can melt away because you know the one who's over the mountain. Many of us are familiar with the movie The Sound of Music, the old classic. And there's a moment where Maria, the nun, is speaking to her mother superior, and she was talking about how she was just being drawn away onto this mountain, and all of a sudden she realized it was late, and she came running down, and Mother Superior says to her, "Suppose darkness had come, and you were lost." And she says, "Mother, I could never be lost up there." She knew that mountain. She knew what was up there. She was familiar with it. And I want to challenge us today that even though there might be stages, there might be levels of walking with God, the more we know Him, the less it feels like, oh, how are we going to do this? How are we going to make it? All of a sudden, the draw of God drowns out everything else. There's one other encouraging part of this whole thing, and that is when you go up a mountain, you can teach others how to do the same thing. It can be passed on. For me, it was going up the mountain with my dad. When I was really little, my mom and dad, they just put me in their backpack, and up the mountain we went. I couldn't walk up a mountain. It was too hard. But as I got a little bit bigger, I could start walking part way, and then I'd need to take, a rest every so often, and eventually I'd say, this is as far as I could go, and I would sit down and we'd, pull out the sandwiches that we packed and we would eat, and then we'd go down. That's as far as I could walk. But as I got older, I could walk the same paths that my father walked. In fact, I got to know those mountains really well. Some of the mountains were really familiar, where we went up those mountains many different times, and before we even came around the side of a cliff face, or before we even came out of the forest, I already knew kind of what was coming. I was familiar with that mountain. There was one particular mountain that we would go up, actually, where we took a break, a little rest once, and my dad said, here, let me show you something. And there was a kind of a gravel path that went up the side of the mountain, and other people were going up that path. He said, come with me, and we went off the path. And all of a sudden, as we went off into the woods, you couldn't quite make it out. It wasn't totally a path, but it was where the old road used to be. It was the old hiking path that was all covered over with roots and trees and mosses, and you couldn't quite make it out. But if you were careful, you could follow up the old path, and it was actually a shortcut. It was a lot faster than the new path. So some of the people that were passing us up earlier, we'd walk along, and all of a sudden we were up at the top before they were. It was like the little treasures, the little secrets of the mountain could be passed on from one generation to another. What are the areas that you've overcome in your walk with God? What are the areas where maybe things used to be difficult, but now you trust Him and you know exactly how to call to Him for certain things because you've seen Him do it before? Those are treasures that you can pass on, where it's not just part of your walk up the mountain with God, but you can hand it on to the next generation or to people that you train and mentor. You can draw them into your walk with God. There's a heritage that we receive in our walk with God. There's a heritage that we can receive as we fellowship with Him, as we say yes to Him, as we're witnesses to Him, and as we come into a friendship with Him. So let me ask you tonight, where are you on God's mountain? Let's pray. Worship team, come on up. God, we are so excited at this opportunity to climb to new heights with you. God, we are so excited that you're calling us up, just like you did Moses. You're calling us up to a higher place with you. Tonight, Lord, I just pray that we learn the lessons that you teach us, even in your creation, even in mountains. And God, I just pray that we would be bold to pursue you as never before, to be willing to go where you've called us, to come up and meet you. Even if it's unfamiliar terrain, even if it's new territory, Lord, I pray for each of us. Bring that confidence in knowing it's God who called. He will be the one to supply. We thank you for the opportunity. and we respond in Jesus' name. Amen.